The autumn wind howled like a wounded animal as Marcus Chen climbed the spiral staircase of Beacon Point Lighthouse for what he believed would be the last time. After 30 years of service, tomorrow was supposed to be his retirement day. The brass key felt heavier than usual in his weathered hands, each step echoing with memories of countless nights guiding ships to safety. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean churned with unprecedented fury. Weather reports warned of Hurricane Delilah, a Category 4 monster that had already claimed lives along the Carolina coast. Marcus had volunteered to stay one final night, ensuring the automated systems functioned properly before his replacement. A young engineer named Thomas Reeves took over. But Thomas never arrived. The phone lines went dead at 8:47 p.m. The cellular towers followed minutes later. Marcus was alone with only the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam and the deafening roar of wind and waves. He checked the backup generator, topped off the fuel reserves, and settled into the observation room with his thermos of coffee and a worn copy of Melville's Moby Dick that he'd been reading for 20 years without finishing. At 11:23 p.m., Marcus spotted something through his binoculars that made his blood run cold. A massive container ship, the Adriana's Fortune, was heading straight toward the Devil's Teeth, a treacherous reef formation that had claimed 17 vessels since 1847. The ship was clearly off course, likely due to navigation system failures in the storm. Marcus grabbed the radio, trying every emergency channel. Static. Nothing but static. He watched in horror as the ship continued its death march toward the rocks. The automated lighthouse beam swept across the water on its programmed rotation, but the ship showed no signs of correcting course. Then Marcus noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. The ship's running lights were flickering in a pattern. Not random, deliberate. Someone on that ship was sending a message in Morse code, an old maritime skill that few remembered in the age of satellites and GPS. Marcus's hands trembled as he translated, "Comms down, steering compromised, 247 souls aboard. Can you see us?" 247 people. Families, children, workers just trying to make a living crossing the ocean. The ship would reach the Devil's Teeth in approximately 12 minutes. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. The automated system was state-of-the-art, computer-controlled, designed to prevent human error. But it was also rigid, following predetermined patterns. He could manually override it, changing the beam's rotation and intensity to specifically warn the ship. However, the override panel was located in the base of the lighthouse, and the manual controls were mechanical. They required someone to stay at the controls, constantly adjusting for as long as needed. His emergency protocol manual was crystal clear. Under no circumstances should the lighthouse keeper leave the observation post during a hurricane. The spiral staircase became treacherous in high winds. The lighthouse had been engineered to sway with the gusts, a necessary flexibility that prevented structural failure, but could disorient and throw a person off balance. 6 keepers had died falling down that staircase over the lighthouse's 142-year history. Moreover, if he went down and something happened to him, the lighthouse would continue its standard automated pattern, but there would be no one to monitor for other emergencies, no one to call for help when communications were restored, no one to make critical decisions. He would be abandoning his post. But 247 people would die if he did nothing. Marcus stared at the ship, then at the staircase leading down, his heart pounding. The wind screamed against the lighthouse walls. The building swayed. In the distance, white foam marked the location of the Devil's Teeth, hungry and waiting. He had to make a choice now. Marcus grabbed the emergency pack from beneath his desk and clipped the safety harness around his waist. If he was going down that staircase, he'd be secured to the guide rail every step of the way. The descent in hurricane conditions violated every safety protocol, but he'd spent 30 years in this lighthouse. He knew every groaning timber, every cold iron step. The moment he opened the observation room door, the wind nearly tore it from its hinges. The staircase groaned beneath him as the lighthouse swayed. Marcus clipped his harness to the guide rail and began descending, counting steps in the darkness. The storm's roar was deafening inside the structure, a symphony of wind and creaking metal. 43 steps down, the lighthouse lurched violently. Marcus's feet slipped, and he swung into the air, held only by his harness. His shoulder slammed into the iron railing with a sickening crack. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he pulled himself back to the steps and continued downward. When he finally reached the base control room, his hands shaking from pain and adrenaline, he had less than 7 minutes before impact. The manual override panel was behind a locked protective cage, another safety measure to prevent tampering. Marcus fumbled for his keyring, selected the right key, and opened the cage. The controls were purely mechanical, wheels, levers, and gears that directly connected to the lighthouse's rotating mechanism and Fresnel lens assembly. He had trained on these systems decades ago, before automation, but hadn't touched them in 15 years. Marcus grabbed the main control wheel and began manually rotating the beam, aiming it directly at the Adriana's fortune. He increased the intensity to maximum, then began flashing it in a pattern. SOS, then danger, then repeatedly flashing toward where the devil's teeth lay hidden beneath the angry waves. Through the small observation window in the control room, he could see the ship's lights. At first, nothing changed. Then, agonizingly slowly, the ship began to turn. Someone had seen his warning. The vessel was attempting to correct course, but the storm fought against every degree of turn. Marcus's injured shoulder screamed in protest as he maintained the beam's position, manually tracking the ship, providing a constant visual reference point. His hands were cramping. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. The lighthouse continued to sway with each gust of wind. 4 minutes, 3, 2. The Adriana's fortune was turning, but was it enough? The ship passed within 50 yards of the devil's teeth, close enough that Marcus could see the white water breaking over the rocks, even in the darkness. But it passed. The ship cleared the reef and continued into deeper, safer water. Marcus collapsed against the control panel, gasping for breath, his shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. He had done it. 247 people would see morning, but he heard something that made his blood freeze, a deep, grinding crack from above. Then another. The lighthouse was making sounds it had never made before. During his descent and the manual operation, the storm had intensified beyond all predictions. The winds had exceeded the lighthouse's design specifications. The manual operation had required locking the rotation mechanism, preventing the structure from yielding to the wind's force as it was designed to do. The added stress, combined with the unprecedented wind speeds, had created a catastrophic situation. The lighthouse was failing. Marcus looked up at the spiral staircase, then at the external door, a thick iron barrier that led directly outside onto the rocky promontory. The staircase offered a route to the observation deck, the highest point where helicopter rescue might reach him. The external door offered immediate escape to ground level, but he'd be exposed to the full force of the hurricane. Neither choice guaranteed survival. The lighthouse might collapse before he could climb up. The storm outside might kill him in seconds, but he had perhaps 30 seconds before the structure's integrity failed completely. The grinding crack came again, louder. Dust and debris fell from above. Marcus had saved 247 people from the sea. Now he had to save himself. He ran for the external door, throwing his full weight against the release bar. The door exploded outward, and the hurricane grabbed him like a giant's hand. He was immediately knocked off his feet, rolling across the wet rocks. The wind was a solid force, pinning him down, drowning out all thought. Marcus crawled toward the old keeper's cottage, a low stone structure built to withstand centuries of storms. Every inch was a battle. His fingers found cracks in the rock, his body pressed flat against the earth. Salt spray blinded him. Blood ran from his lip where he'd bitten through it. Behind him, the lighthouse let out a sound like the end of the world, a deep, resonant groan of yielding metal and stone. Marcus didn't look back. He pulled himself forward, reaching the cottage just as the lighthouse's upper section twisted and collapsed, the great Fresnel lens shattering into a million pieces of reflected moonlight. He crawled through the cottage's door and slammed it behind him. The small structure shook with each wind gust, but the walls held. Marcus collapsed on the floor, his body a map of pain and exhaustion. He was alive. The storm raged through the night. But inside the cottage, Marcus found candles, emergency rations, and an old shortwave radio. As dawn approached and the hurricane's eye passed overhead, bringing temporary calm, he managed to send out a distress signal. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted him 3 hours later. In the hospital, recovering from a dislocated shoulder, 3 broken ribs, and severe hypothermia, Marcus received a visitor he didn't expect. The captain of the Adriana's Fortune, a weathered Brazilian woman named Helena Rodriguez, entered his room with tears in her eyes. "You saved my ship," she said. "You saved my crew. I have a 7-year-old daughter who still has her mother because of you." Marcus smiled weakly. "Just doing the job. The Coast Guard told me everything. They said you violated every safety protocol. They said you should have died 3 times over." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. "My father was a lighthouse keeper in Brazil. He would have done what you did." Inside the box was an antique brass compass and a folded letter. Marcus opened the letter with shaking hands. It was signed by all 247 crew members of the Adriana's Fortune, each name written in different handwriting, different languages, but all expressing the same sentiment. "Thank you for our lives." But as the day wore on and the adrenaline faded, Marcus learned something that turned his triumph to ash. The Coast Guard investigator, a stern man named Wallace, sat beside his bed with a grim expression. "Mr. Chen, I need to inform you of something. While you were manually operating the lighthouse last night, we received a distress call from a small fishing vessel, the Mary Catherine, 15 miles south of your position. They were caught in the storm with engine failure. 23 people aboard. A family fishing operation." Marcus's heart sank. I was at the manual controls. I couldn't have received any calls." "We know. The automated system would have received the distress signal and automatically alerted rescue services through the satellite uplink. But when you overrode the system, you disabled that function. The signal never got through. We only found the wreckage this morning when the storm cleared." The room spun. "How many—" "No survivors. Mr. Chen, I'm not filing charges. You made a decision in an impossible situation. You saved 247 people. But I thought you should know the full picture." After Wallace left, Marcus sat in the hospital bed, staring at the box of thank you letters. He had saved 247 lives. He had lost 23. Would those 23 people have been saved if he'd stayed at his post? If the automated system had remained online? There was no way to know for certain. But the weight of that uncertainty would stay with him forever. Sometimes Marcus would learn, the cost of being a hero is carried by people whose names you never know, whose faces you never see, whose survival depended on a choice you didn't know you were making. The lighthouse was rebuilt 3 years later, fully automated. No human keeper required. Marcus attended the dedication ceremony in a wheelchair. The cold and injuries from that night had accelerated arthritis in his legs. He never told anyone about the Mary Catherine. He carried that secret like a stone in his chest. When children asked him about the night he saved the Adriana's Fortune, he smiled and told them about the bravery of Captain Rodriguez and her crew, who kept the ship under control in impossible circumstances. He told them about the Coast Guard pilots who rescued him. He told them about the engineers who built lighthouses strong enough to withstand centuries of storms. He never told them he was a hero. Heroes, Marcus had learned, don't get to know what they've truly lost. Marcus's hand was on the door handle, ready to descend, when his eyes fell on the emergency protocol manual lying open on his desk. Written in his own handwriting from a training session decades ago was a note in the margin. One keeper's life is never worth one ship. The lighthouse serves all vessels, all nights, all storms. He had written that after reading about Keeper James Morrison, who in 1923 abandoned his post during a storm to help a single grounded vessel. While Morrison was away, 3 other ships lost their bearings without the lighthouse and foundered. 97 people died. Morrison survived but spent the rest of his life in an asylum, broken by guilt. Marcus pulled his hand back from the door. His duty was to the lighthouse itself, to every ship that might pass, not just one. He returned to the observation deck, his heart breaking with every step. Through the binoculars, he watched the Adriana's fortune continue toward the Devil's Teeth. But he didn't just watch. Marcus grabbed the emergency flare pistol from the safety cabinet. It was meant for signaling rescue craft, but light was light. He aimed it through the observation window toward the ship and fired. The red flare arced through the storm, a brief scarlet star against the black sky. Then another, and another. 6 flares total, each one screaming into the night. It was a desperate gamble. Flares were not precise instruments, and in the hurricane they could easily be mistaken for lightning or lost in the chaos. But someone on that ship was watching. Someone saw the pattern of red lights launching from the lighthouse, different from the white beam. Someone understood they were a warning. The Adriana's fortune began to turn. Slowly, fighting the storm, the massive vessel changed course. Marcus watched through his binoculars, holding his breath. The ship passed within 100 yards of the Devil's Teeth, close enough to feel the water's turbulence from the hidden rocks below, but it passed. 247 souls sailed on into the night. Marcus collapsed into his chair, shaking. He had stayed at his post. He had found another way. The lighthouse beam continued its automated sweep, serving every vessel in its range, while he monitored all frequencies for other distress calls. At 2:37 a.m., another call came through. Not through radio, which was still dead, but through the lighthouse's satellite emergency system that he'd been monitoring every 15 minutes. A fishing vessel, the Mary Catherine, was taking on water 15 miles south. 23 people aboard. Engine failure, hull breach. Marcus immediately activated the automated emergency beacon, broadcasting the vessel's position to all Coast Guard frequencies. He couldn't save them himself, couldn't reach them, but he could make sure every rescue asset in the region knew where they were. The Coast Guard cutter Steadfast reached the Mary Catherine at 4:12 a.m. All 23 crew members were rescued, transferred to the cutter in life rafts through 15-foot swells. It was a miracle of seamanship and courage, but it wouldn't have happened if the lighthouse's satellite system hadn't been functioning, if someone hadn't been at the post to receive and relay that call. Marcus monitored through the rest of the night, tracking 4 more vessels through the storm, each one guided safely by the lighthouse's steady beam. When dawn finally broke and the hurricane passed, he had been awake for 31 hours straight. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived at 9:47 a.m. The young pilot, barely 30, helped Marcus down from the observation deck. "You're a legend, sir," the pilot said. "Word came through about the Adriana's fortune. Captain says you saved their lives with those flares." "Just doing the job," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. At his retirement ceremony 3 weeks later, Marcus received commendations from the Coast Guard, letters from Captain Elena Rodriguez of the Adriana's fortune, and a personal phone call from the governor. But the moment that meant the most came from a grizzled fisherman named Patrick O'Malley, captain of the Mary Catherine. "Mr. Chen," O'Malley said, gripping Marcus's hand with both of his own, "they told me you were the one who got our distress call out. My granddaughter was on that boat. She's 8 years old. She's alive because you were where you were supposed to be." Marcus felt tears in his eyes for the first time since that night. "I'm glad I was there." "So am I, brother. So am I." Years later, when they asked Marcus about his final night as a lighthouse keeper, he told them about the power of duty, about how the job of a keeper was never about one ship or one moment, but about being a constant presence in the darkness, a reliable reference point when everything else failed. He told them about the flares, about staying at his post, about trusting that the systems and people designed to save lives would do their jobs if given the right information at the right time. What Marcus never told them was the other truth, that he had almost abandoned his post, that his hand had been on that door handle, that he had been seconds away from descending into the storm. He never told them about the alternate choice that haunted his dreams, the path he didn't take, where he might have saved one ship but lost another, where his courage might have become his greatest mistake. Instead, he kept that close to his heart, a reminder that sometimes the hardest choice is not to act, but to trust in the systems and people around you, to do your job exactly as it should be done, even when every instinct screams to break the rules. On his 83rd birthday, Marcus returned to Beacon Point Lighthouse, now fully automated and requiring no human presence. He stood at the base of the rebuilt structure. They'd reinforced it after Hurricane Delilah, making it stronger than ever, and looked up at the light beginning its nightly rotation. The young ranger giving tours recognized him and asked the question every visitor asked, "Do you think lighthouses are obsolete now that we have GPS and satellites?" Marcus smiled, watching the beam sweep across the darkening water. Technology fails. Storms knock out satellites, ships lose power. But a lighthouse just keeps turning, keeps shining, keeps doing its job. As long as there are people who go down to the sea in ships, there will be people who need a light in the darkness. Were you ever scared during that last night? Terrified, Marcus admitted. But fear doesn't relieve you of duty, it just makes duty harder. And sometimes doing your duty exactly as you're supposed to do it, no more, no less, is the most courageous choice of all. The ranger nodded thoughtfully. As the tour moved on, Marcus stayed behind, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the waves. In his pocket, he carried 2 items, a brass compass from Captain Rodriguez of the Adriana's Fortune, and a small carved wooden whale from Patrick O'Malley's granddaughter, now a marine biologist studying in California. Both gifts represented lives saved, but more than that, they represented trust. Trust in systems, trust in duty, trust in the simple act of being where you're supposed to be, doing what you're supposed to do, exactly when it matters most. Marcus touched the lighthouse wall once more, feeling the cold stone beneath his palm. "Thank you," he whispered to the structure that had been his partner for 30 years, "for teaching me what it means to serve." The light swept on, as it always had, as it always would, constant and faithful in the darkness. And that, Marcus knew, was enough.